A man would brutally murder 3 children in a violent fit of rage. He would become known as the Monster of Worcester. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you know what to do. Let's get started. David Anthony McGreavy was born in Southport in 1951 to Bella and Thomas McGreavy, and he was the second eldest of 6 children. David would spend a lot of his childhood moving around because his father was a sergeant in the Royal Signals. So they moved from one army base to another. So he went from places like England to Germany, but according to his mother, living in Germany was one of the happiest times in his life. She said that the children would often picnic and bike in the woods and even went skiing. By all accounts, his childhood was quite normal. In 1967, David left school to join the Royal Navy, where he hoped to make a career. But he was soon dismissed from the Navy in August of 1971 after being court-martialed for intentionally setting a fire. Many people found this behavior strange because, as his mother Bella would later state, that there was only one incident in his childhood that caused her concern. When the family was living in Cardiff, David stole his mother's shopping money in order to take a trip to Liverpool. So that was pretty impulsive and quite strange of David to do. And then, of course, when he was about 15 or 16, he dropped out of school and enlisted in the Royal Navy. And although it appeared to be David's lifelong ambition to join the Navy, his father had doubted his dedication. If we go back to his time while he was in the Navy, it appears his colleagues from those days would say that he was pretty much an arrogant young man. He seemed to always have to have the last word. He was quite cocky, and he did get into a lot of trouble because of this. While David was in the Royal Navy, it appeared that he worked as a steward in the mess hall, and one day he saw his name written in a chief petty officer's book. For some reason, he thought that this indicated a change of job, and for some reason, this deeply upset him. So David would start drinking, and his colleagues would note that he turned up for his watch that night, and he was very agitated and drunk, and then he would do something completely insane. David would break into an officer's wardroom and set fire to a bin that had papers in it. He would claim that he did it on accident because he dropped a cigarette. So he would raise the alarm at 2:30 in the morning, stating that there was a fire, and of course that it was an accident. But of course the Navy didn't believe him, and he was then court-martialed. He wasn't found guilty of arson, but he was found guilty of negligence, and he was sentenced to 90 days detention. During this time, he would also undergo psychiatric testing, but his commanding officer never revealed the results of this psychiatric testing, and his parents were given no explanation of why he committed this bizarre behavior, and it appears that this psychiatric report still isn't available for the public. But it does seem that perhaps David was developing a pattern of impulsiveness. He stole his mother's money because he wanted to go somewhere, and then of course when he thought for some reason that his job was going to be changed, and apparently he didn't want that, he decided to set fire to a man's room. The only difference is, at the time of the fire, David had started to drink, and it seems that alcohol had been affecting him greatly. In 1971, David started a relationship with a woman named Mary. From January to April, they exchanged 2 letters a week, and David's letters became longer and longer. Eventually, in April of 1971, he meets Mary for the very first time, and then 1 week later at a social event, he proposes to her. After the engagement, David would see Mary for 2 long weekends in June and July. And after that, his letter writing increased in intensity and length. But it appears David's mother disapproved of the relationship. It turns out that Mary was suffering from significant health problems. She had issues with her spine, and quite frankly, she was uncomfortable often. The thing is, if this condition wasn't treated, it could one day lead to her being paralyzed. But David's mother didn't seem to understand this, and she thought that Mary was a hypochondriac and that she was exaggerating her pain levels. By August of 1971, David's naval career was finally over. He had been dismissed. He would turn up at his parents' house, and he just dropped his bags on the floor and said, "I'm out." Apparently, the end of this childhood dream was very devastating to David, and he would go from job to job. He would work as a chef and as a laborer, and eventually he was fired from both of them. Oftentimes it was because of his arrogance, his bad attitude, and of course, the fact that he had become an alcoholic. During this time, David would focus on marrying his fiancée Mary. They had planned to marry in Christmas of 1971, but he was jobless and broke and started to fantasize about having a big and traditional and, quite frankly, expensive wedding. But Mary was the opposite. She was more grounded and had an understanding of the fact that they certainly couldn't afford it. Mary would have been fine just going to the courthouse and having a small ceremony afterwards. Eventually, Mary would come to her senses and finally called off the engagement. By 1972, David was about 20 or 21 years old, and he had no work and certainly had no money. And instead of just looking for a job and trying to do his best and, maybe become a better person, he really just decided to do nothing. He wouldn't do any household chores to help his family out. He wasn't contributing to rent because he didn't have a job. He wasn't looking for work. And eventually his parents grew so frustrated that they threw him out of his home. At this point, David's family did know that he was drinking quite heavily, and I'm sure they thought that if they threw him out, perhaps he would have to get a job and get his life together. But it didn't turn out that way. By 1972, David was unable to live with his parents, but he began boarding with his friend Clive Ralph and his wife Elsie. During this time, they had 2 small children, Paul and Dawn Marie. Clive and Elsie had been school friends, and there was a 5-year age difference between them. They had married in September of 1968 when Elsie was 16 and pregnant with their firstborn. At the time that David moved in, Elsie was pregnant with their 3rd child, Samantha Jane, who was born in September of 1972. During this time, David was employed at a factory job. He did pitch in for rent, and he sometimes helped cook Sunday dinner. Clive Ralph at the time was working for his father as a driver, and when baby Samantha was about 7 months old, Elsie became a barmaid at a pub in Worcester, and it was about 2 miles from their home. Because Clive and Elsie were both busy working, David would sometimes act as a babysitter for the Ralph children, and it appears that David loved children. Anybody that knew him would say that he did love children, and he really loved the Ralph children. Elsie would say that he frequently played with his children and even acted like a father to them. Sometimes he would even chastise her over her discipline of their firstborn Paul. Elsie would later say, "We lived in a cul-de-sac. There was about 10 houses in the cul-de-sac, and there were children in every houses. And it was one of those places where everybody left their door open for anybody to come in and out. And everybody looked after everybody." With the birth of their 3rd child, that meant there were 6 people living in one small 2-bedroom home. Elsie would later say, "David shared the bedroom with Paul. Samantha was only little, so she was still in a little cradle cot. And then Dawn had another bed with us. As the time was going on, we were going to look for a bigger place anyway, but it didn't get to that part." Neighbors would say that David was a bit of a know-it-all, but he was quite harmless, until he started to drink. A reporter would later say he was well known in the local Nick, and they pulled him in once or twice. The classic case was he's walking down one of the main streets in the middle of the road, walking the white lines to prove he wasn't drunk. It upset his dad because his dad lived not far away, and he told him to keep off the booze. Unfortunately, David didn't listen, and what happened next would destroy the lives of not only 3 children, but 2 parents as well. I do want to note that the details of this case are quite graphic, so viewer discretion is advised. On April 13th, 1973, Elsie Ralph was picked up from work by Clive, who had left home late while the 3 children are all asleep. It was pretty typical of Clive to pick her up late to help her with closing up the bar and to have a last pint for the night. When Clive and Elsie Ralph arrived at their home, the police were already there and escorted them to the police station. There, they were told some gruesome and terrible news. Their children, all 3 of them, had been murdered. And the person that did it was none other than David McGreavy. It turns out that David had been at a pub earlier that evening with a friend, where he drank about 5 to 7 pints of beer. The 2 men would play cards and darts, and there was a small altercation that took place prior to leaving the pub. Turns out that David had put a cigarette out in his friend's beer. Clive did pick David up from that pub and brought him home to look after the children while he went to get his wife from work. Sometime between 10:15 and 11:15 p.m., David became enraged at the Ralph children. Samantha had been crying for a bottle, and apparently David would violently kill Samantha and then the 2 other children, each in a different manner. Samantha died from a skull fracture, 2-year-old Dawn had her throat slit, and 4-year-old Paul was strangled to death. And then, after killing the 3 children, David went down to the basement and retrieved a pickaxe. With this pickaxe, he would mutilate their bodies further. And that's not the worst of it. After this man murdered and mutilated 3 innocent children who did nothing wrong, he picked up their bodies and impaled them on spikes of a wrought fence in a neighbor's yard. He would then leave home. He was arrested by 3:50 a.m., walking near the Rolfs' home. When he was arrested, David reportedly said, "What's this all about?" And at first he would deny any responsibility, but several hours later he stated, "It was me, but it wasn't me." And then he would describe in graphic and disturbing details what he had done. He would tell the police, quote, "I put my hand over Samantha's mouth and it went from there. It's all in the house. On Paul, I used a wire. I was going to bury him, but I couldn't. I went outside and I put them on the fence. All I could hear is kids, kids, kids." And really his only explanation for murdering them was that the baby would not stop crying. He would later appear in court and plead guilty for the murders of all 3 Rolf children. The hearing would only last 8 minutes, and of course he was sentenced to multiple life terms with minimums of 20 years. While in prison, other prisoners were determined to target David, which meant that David was moved and would spend most of his 45 years behind bars in protected conditions. During his time, it was reported that he successfully adjusted to prison life, accepted rehabilitation, and engaged in painting. Because of how brutal this crime was and the fact that he just murdered 3 innocent children who did nothing wrong, he became known as the Monster of Worcester. Around 2006, David was transferred to an open prison, which allowed him to stay in a hostel in Liverpool. Suddenly, he became front page news when a reporter found him walking on a Liverpool street, and of course this outraged people. So he was again transferred back to a closed prison. But this case gets even worse. In December of 2018, following a parole hearing, the report said that he had, quote, changed considerably over the last 45 years, and this legally cleared him for release on parole. So David McGreavy is a free man. Of course, the children's mother firmly believes that he should have never been let out. She would go on to say that ever since her children's death, she doesn't celebrate Christmas. She doesn't do anything like that because it's too upsetting to her. She says when there's parties and Christmases that she can't go in the mix because it's that upsetting. She does still visit the graves of her children as much as possible. She would say, "I've just had to live with it ever since. I've got it in my head all the time." At the time of David's release, the Minister of Justice said that David will be on license for the rest of his life and subject to strict conditions. They also stated that the government had quadrupled funding for victim support services since 2010 and had introduced the Victims and Prisoners Bill to, quote, ensure victims are better supported and ministers have the power to block the release of dangerous offenders like David McGreavy. The thing about this case is everyone feels that it just came out of nowhere. That David had never been violent, that David hadn't ever shown any sign of having violent tendencies. Of course, we can see how impulsive he was, that he stole money from his mother, he dropped out of school, something went wrong at work and he instantly jumped to conclusions and started a fire. That's not normal behavior. And if we think about it, he was 16 years old in the Navy and drinking heavily. Alcoholism at a young adult, a child, 16 is still a teenager, a child, had to have some rampant effects on him. But people did describe him as arrogant and egotistical, impulsive. Maybe people just didn't see that he perhaps was a narcissist. And again, I'm not a licensed psychiatrist. I cannot give any sort of diagnosis, but all the little details are seemingly adding up into some sort of personality disorder. The facts are 3 little children lost their lives in a brutal and vicious way. And the man that did this to them is walking the streets today. Was David, the Monster of Worcester, rehabilitated? Should he be out on the streets? Let me know what you think in the comments below. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you next week.